Welcome to the Voiceware Tips and Tricks series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to get a proxy or analog lines or PRI connected to that proxy to send those calls up to the hosted or the primary Voiceware server so that the analog lines or PRI on a proxy can be used for something. So first we're going to take a look at the abstract on how this works, and then we're going to look at the nitty-gritty on how you actually set it up. So to begin with, we have our analog lines coming in, whether those are POTS lines or a PRI. And if we look here, these calls come down into the proxy. Again, the proxy is on site, and a Voiceware system in proxy mode acts very similar to a gateway. So its main job is to just translate an analog phone call over to a SIP signal and then send that call up to another system. Remember, in proxy mode, Voiceware doesn't act with its normal call processing and IVRs and call tree, things like that. All it does is translate SIP to analog, analog to SIP. So when the analog call comes in, what we need to do is we need to take that call and we need to send it up to the main hosted Voiceware system, just like a guest room call would come in. It wouldn't be processed on the proxy system. It would be sent over to the main Voiceware system. And that's what we're going to do here. So you see that the analog call comes in, hits the proxy, and the proxy basically takes and immediately sends it right back out. It doesn't process it, it doesn't think about it too much, and it sends it out over a SIP link over to the main Voiceware server. So we're going to be taking a look at how to set this up on the proxy and on the main server to make this all work. It's fairly, I don't want to say easy, but it is a straightforward concept once you understand this diagram. So again, the call is coming in on an analog or a PRI to the proxy. The proxy is going to take and not process the call. All it's going to do is reroute it directly back out over a SIP link to the main server. Once it hits the main server, then it's like a call coming in any other way, and the main server can process it and route it based on DID or send it to an IVR or do whatever you'd normally do with a call coming in on the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two systems here. Now, the system here that I'm using, Abigail, is not set up in a normal proxy mode. So you'll see some additional DIDs and things that you normally don't see on a proxy, but we're going to pretend a little bit here and pretend that Abigail is set up in a proxy mode. So the first thing we need to do is create an IVR. And this IVR is responsible for taking the call that comes in over the analog lines or the PRI and kicking it back out of the system. So it's a very, very simple IVR. So we're just going to click Add IVR here. We're going to name it Forward. The name is irrelevant. You can name it whatever you want. And then our only state is going to be forward. And we're going to take and forward the call to 91000. Now, this number is arbitrary, but if you are routing a lot of lines, let's say you have 6 or 10 analog lines connected to your proxy that you want to reroute out to the main system, you're going to need to have some sort of logic behind this. So don't just pick an arbitrary number. Sit down and figure out, okay, how many lines do I have and how many do I need to forward out? And let's get a number scheme that makes at least a little bit of sense so that if you have to troubleshoot this later, you're not looking at this and trying to spend or spending 30 minutes trying to even figure out what's going on. But for this case, we're just going to use this number. I'm going to copy this number because we're going to need it later. And then I'm just going to click Save. And you'll see here that this IVR is the simplest IVR that ever was. All it does is the call is going to come in and it's going to forward it to 91000 and then hang up. And that's all we needed to do. So we're good here. So the next thing you might remember you need to do from training is anytime you create an IVR, you need to create a dial plan for it. And there's no exception here. So we're going to go ahead and add an extension. And this is, again, an arbitrary number, 750. I don't think that's used in the system here. And we'll create an IVR, or label it as IVR rather. and we'll select our forward IVR. Again, this system is a bit cluttered with other IVRs. In a real proxy, you wouldn't see any IVRs at all, just ones you created, so it's a little bit easier to deal with on a true proxy system. So we need to create an internal extension 750 for this IVR, and we'll just save that. The next thing you need to do, which is not arbitrary, is you need to take the DID number that's coming into the proxy, and you need to point it to this new IVR so the call can be rerouted. The common thing is if you have analog lines, recall that Voiceware assigns a DID to them, and they're the strange DIDs of 1000 or excuse me, it's 4 zeros and a 1, 4 zeros and a 2, so on and so forth. We're going to mimic that here. So let's say that we have an analog line coming in on the first port on our analog card. That's going to ring in as DID 00001 in Voiceware. And what we're going to do is, as you might expect, this is a DID, and we are going to point it to 750, our forward IVR. Now again, I mentioned before, but if you're doing a lot of DIDs, you probably want to make some sort of relationship between the DID number and the name of your IVR, just to keep it a little bit simpler so that someone looking at it later has a clear idea of what's going on. In this example, we're only doing one DID. We only have one analog line, apparently, that we want forwarded. So it's a little bit simpler here. Then we're going to click Save. So if we look here and do a sort, we'll see that we have this DID coming in, and it's going to be routed to the internal extension 750, which is an IVR that's forward, and that is going to forward out to 1000. So our last step on the proxy is to go to outbound routes, and we're going to add a route. Is 91000, and you'll see here that I have some SIP links. We're going to set up a new SIP link here, and in fact we probably should have done that before this step. So let's cancel real quick and let's go over to devices. So I lied to you about this being the last step. This is second to last. So what we need to do next is we need to create the SIP link. Recall in our picture here, we had a SIP link between the proxy and the main system. This is not something that normally exists in a proxy. So normally a proxy, you set up the guest rooms and you tell them to register over to the main server. They don't need this SIP link. We're going to have to create this to send over the trunk calls. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to Add Device. And this is kind of interesting because in a normal SIP trunk that you might get from a carrier like Bandwidth or FlowRoute or whoever, they'll do one half of this equation, and we on the Voiceware side do the other. In this example, we're going to do both halves of the equation. This is very much like setting up a SIP trunk. We're just being able to set up both sides of it. So we're going to create a device, and I'll just name this 7050. Again, this device name and secret, these are arbitrary. As long as they're the same on both sides, they can be anything you want. And we're going to call this, as you might imagine, let's do this. HANA is the test system that we're going to be linking to, so I'm just going to call this HANA SIP link. In your environment, again, this friendly name, you can call this anything you want. Secret, we're going to copy because we'll need that later. And we're going to, in this case, we're going to create this one as the initiating side. So in a SIP trunk environment, you normally have one side that initiates the connection to the other. Think of it kind of like a pitcher and a catcher. So someone needs to throw the ball and someone needs to catch it. In this example, the test system Abigail is going to initiate the contact. So Abigail is going to be the pitcher throwing the ball out to Hannah. So in this case, Abigail needs to be told exactly where Hannah lives. so that she could throw the ball to the correct person. The catcher doesn't care where the ball comes from, it just catches it. So you don't need to tell Hannah where the ball is coming from. That analogy is seen here in the host. So we're going to go over here to our host, and we're going to see that this is our system that we're going to have receive the call. And I'm going to go down here to the IP address and copy that out. And then I'm going to tell Abigail here, okay, when you want to initiate the SIP link, this is your host. This is the one you talk to. This is, of course, NAT and registered. And we're going to click same as above. And that'll copy down the secret, the registered username, the SIP registered server. We're also going to set the friend type or the insecure type to invite. This creating a SIP to SIP link is actually something that's in the manual. If you look in the how-to section, it already talks about how to set this up. So if you need reference, you can use that. And again, we're going to copy the password and we're going to remember 750. We're going to save this. And we are going to jump over to Hannah real quick and set up the other half of our SIP link just so you can see what that looks like. And then we'll come back to Abigail and finish up our outbound routes. So we'll go over to devices here, and we're going to create a device. As you can imagine, we're going to call it 750. Again, these numbers can be arbitrary, but they need to match on both sides. And we're going to call this Abigail link. Call limit blank. I should go over to the other side and make sure I made the call limit blank on that side as well. And oh, I forgot. I realized I forgot something on the other side as well. So we'll see here. So you got 750 Abigail link. You got the secret, and that's about all you need to do. Check NAT because this is a catcher. Again, the host is dynamic. It doesn't care where it comes from. Abigail is going to initiate a connection to Hannah, and as long as the username and the secret match, then you're good. So we're just going to save that. Over back on the Abigail side, I did make a slight error here. I'm going to need to select usable as trunk and set our channels to 99 and take that out. This is important. This usable as trunk is required because otherwise we can't select this to send calls out to Hannah, which is the entire point of the SIP link. So we do need to make sure that we select usable as trunk, channels 99, and then remove your call limit. As a SIP trunk, that's always the default method. And we'll just save that again. And as you can see here, we have a ping time now. So that's a good sign. It's actually talking up to the system. And the last thing we need to do here on Abigail is we need to go over to our outbound routing. And we need to create an outbound route. Now, if you recall, I'm going to open up our IVR again. Our IVR is forwarding to 91000. So as you might imagine, we need to create an outbound route that is 91000. And then we are going to select the Hannah SIP link. And we're going to go ahead and strip off the first digit. Now, all of this, again, is a little bit arbitrary. Because you're basically both sides of the telco, you can set up, I could have changed my forward here to omit the 9 and just be 1000, or be any sort of DID I want. In fact, a good idea here, depending on what you're doing, might be to make this DID the actual DID that the telco is providing. This is a great idea in the case that you're doing this analog forward temporarily until you have your SIP trunk set up. If you make this the actual DID, let's say, 303-555-2020 or whatever your DID happens to be, you can send that number over to the main system, in this case Hannah, And you only have to create one DID on HANA, and I'll show you that here in just a moment. So we'll do this both ways. I'll go back and forth and show you what it looks like. We don't have to rate this call. We're just going to strip the 9, and we're sending it over the HANA link, so we'll save that route. And so that's all the work we have to do on Abigail. It's quite a few steps. Remember that we first created the IVR, then we went over to the dial plan and we associated it with an internal extension 750. We also associated it with a DID number, and this is coming in from the either your PRI, your T1, or your analog card, whatever you're connected with. That way, when the call comes in, it matches this DID, forwards the call to 750, or sends a call to 750. The IVR forwards the call out to 9001. Then we have an outbound route that takes 99100 and sends it over the SIP link and strips the first digit. The last thing that we really need to do to make this fully functional is we have already created the device here on the HANA side. So we have the catcher's mitt, so the call will get passed from one Voiceware system to the other. But when it comes in, you might imagine that the last thing we need to do is we need to create a dial plan entry for it. And that dial plan entry, if you have been paying attention, should be obvious. We're going to make this 1000. If you're confused on why it's 1000, remember that on the Abigail side, it's 91000 as a pattern that our IVR set up, but we're stripping the first digit. So we're stripping off that 9. And so by the time it gets to HANA, all that's left on the DID is a 1000. And we're going to select this as a DID, and then you can point this to its ultimate endpoint. Meaning, where do you want this call to actually end up on the actual system? Do you want this to go to a call group, an IVR? Is this someone's direct DID? You know, wherever it needs to go. So we'll just send it to the operator group for now. And that's how you set that up. So I'm going to show you a slight variation on this that again is useful if you are doing this whole forward thing as a temporary solution until you can have the numbers ported over on your SIP trunk. There's a little technique that you can use just to save yourself some work. So let's go back here to Abigail, and I'm going to go back to our IVRs, and I'm going to go back to our forward. And let's change this. So let's say that once the forward is done, once the port is done, let's say one of the main numbers that you're porting over to you from your, your old telco to your SIP carrier is 303-555-2020. Okay, this is a DID. This is the actual hotel's main number. Let's say. We're going to take this and leave it as is. We're not going to add a 9 or do anything else. We're going to save this. And then we are going to go over to our dial plan and our outbound routing. And we are going to edit this plan. And we are going to put this pattern in there. And then we're going to edit this. And we're not going to strip off any digits whatsoever. We're going to strip 0 digits. So this is the number that the IVR, again, translates from that 00001 that the analog card will give you into a normal DID. Save the route. And then we're going to go back to the HANA side, and we're going to change our DID number here, again, to this. The reason to do this is once the forward is complete, it will just start working. Meaning we are sort of preloading or anticipating what the SIP provider is going to give us. So once your porting to the SIP provider is complete, let's assume that the SIP provider is just giving you a straight 10-digit DID. Then Once that's complete, you don't have to go in and change anything because the DID that you set up here, remember, Voiceware doesn't care where the call comes from. So if it comes over the SIP link from Abigail one day, it's going to hit this DID and it's going to work. But then the next day, the SIP provider ports the number early and doesn't tell you. Well, that's irrelevant because the DID that the SIP provider is going to give you is the same one that you set up Abigail, your proxy system, to give you. And so it doesn't matter. You don't have to go in and change anything. So it's just a little tip to make your life a little bit easier. That way the port can happen and it just works. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to go back and do anything. The last thing I'm going to mention here is that when you do this, the whole SIP link and the translating from the proxy to the analog side, it can, the from the proxy to the main hosted system, it can be a little bit confusing, especially for someone else to go in and look at your system, i.e. tech support, or maybe someone else working in your company. So it's a good idea to go into the settings page and to look at your system notes and add some system notes about what's going on, just so that someone later on could go in and say, okay, this setup is very strange, or let's say, a year down the line, the porting's complete, but you never went in and took out the SIP link. It might be very confusing for someone to look at that later and say, this system HANA is on SIP trunks. Why on earth do we have a SIP link down to the proxy? And what's going on here? So don't forget to put in system notes. Notes are never for yourself right away. They're always for people a month, 2 months, or a year down the line. So make sure they're descriptive about what's going on, why you did it, why the setup's there, and especially reasons on when it might be removed. A note about, once the SIP trunk port is complete, this is not needed anymore, is a great note for someone looking at this a year later and saying, oh, well, okay, the SIP trunk, the SIP port is well completed at this point. We don't need this setup any longer, so we can take this out and not worry about it. That concludes our video on how to set up a proxy system to speak to a hosted system. Just one last review, you have the analog lines coming in. Once they hit the proxy, you need to set up an IVR to take those calls and reroute them back out. You need to create a SIP link. You need to create the pitcher side on the proxy is the way I prefer to do it. And then that sends the call down over to the main server. You need to set up a SIP trunk there to be the catcher of that call. And then you need to set up a DID on this side to take that number and to route it appropriately. Of course, in all of this, you need to test early, make sure that once you set this all up and you think it's working, you need to test a few calls on it, make sure that they do go where you need to go. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for some other tips and tricks videos.